back to IBT. We finished last episode by describing issues that were facing a buyer and seller, and the basic legal framework in which an international transaction operates. In this episode, we will show you what a typical international transaction looks like, and how transacting parties routinely carry out overseas transactions. Mr. Legalese, can you take us through the mechanics of how international transactions work?
Sure. You see, most modern IBTs are completed by using a documentary sale. Now, this is a very important concept to understand, so we're going to break it down. A documentary sale basically means that all the parties agree to have a set of documents serve as symbolic goods. In other words, the documents become a surrogate for the goods and services being sold, and they will be traded and handled as if they were the goods themselves.
But why would the parties want such a system?
Well, I mean, imagine it. You got these two parties. They'd never dealt with each other before, thousands of miles of oceans between them. Neither party has a reason to trust each other, right? But both of them want to trade with each other. However, because they have not worked together before, well, they need, some sort of trading system that ensures proper compensation, delivery, reliability, while all minimizing the risk of fraud or deceit. And without this kind of system, parties would be in murky waters as far as when to send money, who owns the goods, whose money is what, when to send the goods, who insures the goods, all those things.
So, are you saying that even though the parties want to work together, they might not be able to complete a transaction because of a lack of trust? Can you give us an example?
All right, for instance, let's say a buyer in Africa wants to purchase widgets from a seller in Korea. Now, the buyer needs to send payments to Korea, and the seller needs to send the goods to Africa. And the buyer says, well, you send me the goods and I'll send you the money. And the seller says, no, you send me the money, I'll send you the goods. And it goes back, and it goes forth, it goes back, and it goes forth, until either one of the parties takes a risk and commits first, or the deal just falls through. Now, either way, you can imagine how desirable it would be for an international party to have a reliable system for exchange.
So this is where the documentary sale comes in.
Yes. Using the documentary sale system means that both buyer and seller have a more reliable, less risky method of conducting international business.
So how does this apply to a transaction of goods?
Well, to make it more clear, I've actually prepared a small demonstration of what a very basic documentary sale looks like. So here we have the rudiments of a documentary sale. First, there's a seller and there's a buyer. Between them, they negotiate a sales contract. Now, here's the problem. There's a large ocean in between the buyer and the seller. So what do they have to do? The seller is going to take the goods that they want to sell to the buyer, put them on a ship. The ship will in exchange give a bill of lading to the seller, signifying that the goods are indeed on the ship and headed towards the buyer. The seller will then ship that bill of lading over to the buyer, in exchange for which the buyer will give money, boom, to the seller. He pays for the documents, and the seller is now happy. Now, the buyer will take those documents and give them to the ship. In exchange, the ship will release the goods to the buyer, and the buyer's happy. That is a basic documentary sale.
Okay, so the person who loads the goods on the boat makes up a document saying they have control of the goods. I can see how the buyer would feel more comfortable in that situation, because they would have some kind of evidence that the seller has done what they said they would do. What about the seller, though? In this scenario, they would have made the product and put it on a boat, and all the buyer has done is wait for proof? Isn't that unfair to the seller? What if the buyer doesn't have the money to cover the sale? Wouldn't that put the seller in a tough position because they would have already sent the product?
Well, yeah, this is a very real concern to the seller. If they don't get paid, they can't stay in business. For this reason, the seller wants to see proof that the buyer has the funds available, and that those funds will still be available when the goods are shipped.
So the seller feels better because a bank, not just a buyer, is saying that the funds are available?
Yes. Let's take a look at that same basic transaction while getting some banks involved to provide an extra level of security, shall we? So, this is a case where the buyer and the seller are again separated by the ocean, but they want a little more security in the transaction. So, what the buyer will do is enlist the buyer's bank, also called the issuing bank. Now, this is a bank that the buyer knows and that trusts. And the seller will enlist the help of a seller's bank. And this is again a bank that the seller knows and trusts. Now what the buyer will do is secure a line of credit with the buyer's bank. Now this letter of credit will be issued in the seller's name, and in turn the seller's bank will act as a confirming bank for the buyer's bank, saying basically that they will take on the responsibility of paying the buyer's bank's letter of credit there. So you have two banks that will both vouch that the money will be there for the seller. Now, with this assurance, the seller can then go ahead, put the goods on the ship. The ship will give a bill of lading to the seller. The seller will then take that bill of lading and perhaps some other documents, whatever the term of the letter of credit is, give it to the seller's bank. In exchange, the seller's bank will give payment to the seller, making the seller very happy, as you can see. Seller's bank will then take that bill of lading and perhaps other documents, give it to the buyer's bank in exchange for payment. The seller's bank is happy. The buyer's bank will then sell the bill of lading to the buyer. In exchange, the buyer will give payment to the buyer's bank, making the buyer's bank very happy. The buyer will then give the bill of lading to the ship. In exchange, the ship will give the goods to the buyer, making the buyer very happy. And as you can see, everybody is now very happy.
So a bill of lading proves goods are shipped, and a letter of credit proves the money for the goods is available.
Yes. So, the bill of lading is a surrogate for the goods, and the letter of credit is a surrogate for the money, just like a check is a surrogate for cold, hard cash.
That wraps up this episode on the moves of an international business transaction. We showed you an overview of a documentary sale, and hopefully gave you insight into the mechanics of a basic international transaction. Join us next time as we start to investigate some of the tools used by the business world to help simplify these complex interactions.